Voices Beyond Pages. This is The Fall of Gondolin by J.R.R. Tolkien. It was now 4 hours still from the middle night, and the sky was red in the north, and in the east, and in the west. And those serpents of iron had reached the levels of Tumladen, and those fiery ones were among the lowest slopes of the hills, so that the guards were taken and set in evil torment by the Balrogs that scoured all about, saving only to the further south, where was Cristorn, the cleft of eagles. Then did King Torgon call a council, and thither fared Tuor and Meglin as royal princes, and Dwelin came with Egalmoth and Penlod the Tall, and Rog strode thither with Galdor of the Tree, and golden Glorfindel, and Ecthelion of the Voice of Music. Thither too fared Salgon, a tremble at the tidings, and other nobles beside of less blood, but better heart. Then spoke Tuor, and this was his rede, that a mighty sally be made forthwith, ere the light and heat grew too great in the plain. And many backed him, being but of different minds as to whether the sally should be made by the entire host, with the maids and wives and children amidmost, or by diverse bands, seeking out in many directions, and to this last Tuor leaned. But Meglin and Salgon alone held other counsel, and were for holding to the city, and seeking to guard those treasures that lay within. Out of guile did Meglin speak thus, fearing lest any of the Noldoli escape the doom that he had brought upon them, and he dreaded lest his treason become known, and somehow vengeance find him in after days. But Salgon spoke both echoing Meglin, and being grievously afraid of issuing from the city, for he was fain rather to do battle from an impregnable fortress than to risk hard blows upon the field. Then the lord of the house of the Mole played upon the one weakness of Torgon, saying, "Lo, O king, the city of Gondolin contains a wealth of jewels, and metals and stuffs, and of things wrought by the hands of the gnomes to surpassing beauty. And all these thy lords, more brave meseems than wise, would abandon to the foe. Even should victory be thine upon the plain, thy city will be sacked, and the Balrogs get hence with their measureless booty." And Torgon groaned, for Meglin had known his great love for the wealth and loveliness of that burg upon Amon Gwareth. Again said Meglin, putting fire in his voice, "Lo, hast thou for naught laboured through years uncounted at the building of walls of impregnable thickness, and in the making of gates whose valour may not be overthrown? Is the power of the hill Amon Gwareth become as lowly as the deep vale, or the hoard of weapons that lie upon it, and its unnumbered arrows of so little worth that in the hour of peril thou wouldest cast all aside and go naked into the open against enemies of steel and fire, whose trampling shakes the earth, and the encircling mountains ring with the clamour of their footsteps?" And Salgon quailed to think of it, and spoke noisily, saying, "Meglin speaks well, O king, hear thou him." Then The king took the counsel of those twain, though all the lords said otherwise. Nay, rather the more for that. Therefore at his bidding does all that folk abide now the assault upon their walls. But Tuor wept, and left the king's hall, gathering the men of the wing, went through the streets, seeking his home. And by that hour was the light great and lurid, and there was stifling heat, and a black smoke and stench arose about the pathways to the city. And now came the monsters across the valley, and the white towers of Gondolin reddened before them. But the stoutest were in dread, seeing those dragons of fire, and those serpents of bronze and iron, that fare already about the hill of the city, and they shot unavailing arrows at them. Then is there a cry of hope, for behold, the snakes of fire may not climb the hill for its steepness, and for its glassiness, and by reason of the quenching waters that fall upon its sides, yet they lie about its feet, and a vast steam arises where the streams of Amon Gwareth and the flames of the serpents drive together. Then grew there such a heat that women became faint, and men sweated to weariness beneath their mail, and all the springs of the city, save only the fountain of the king, grew hot and smoked. But now Gothmog, lord of the Balrogs, captain of the hosts of Melko, took command, and gathered all things of iron that could coil themselves around, and above all obstacles before them. These he bid pile themselves before the northern gate, and behold, their great spires reached to its threshold, and thrust at the towers and bastions about it. And by reason of the exceeding heaviness of their bodies, those gates fell, and great was the noise thereof. Yet the most of the walls around them still stood firm. Then the engines and the catapults of the king poured darts and boulders and molten metals on those ruthless beasts, and their hollow bellies clanged beneath the buffeting. Yet it availed not, for they might not be broken, and the fires rolled off them. Then were the topmost opened about their middles, and an innumerable host of the Orcs, the goblins of hatred, poured therefrom into the breach. And who shall tell of their scimitars, or the flash of their broad-bladed spears, which they stabbed? Then did Rog shout in a mighty voice, and all the people of the Hammer of Wrath, and the kindred of the tree with Galdor the valiant, leapt at the foe. There the blows of their great hammers and the dint of their clubs rang to the encircling mountains, and the Orcs fell like leaves, and those of the Swallow and the Arch poured arrows like the dark rains of autumn upon them, and both Orcs and Gondolin fell thereunder for the smoke and the confusion. Great was that battle, yet for all their valour the Gondolin, by reason of the might of ever-increasing numbers, were borne slowly back, till the goblins held part of the northernmost city. At this time is Tuor at the head of the folk of the wing, struggling in the turmoil of the streets, and now he wins through to his house, and finds that Meglin is before him. Trusting in the battle now begun about the northern gate, and in the uproar in the city, Meglin had looked to this hour for the consummation of his designs. Learning much of the secret delving of Tuor, yet only at the last moment had he got this knowledge, and he could not discover all, he said naught to the king or any other, for it was his thought that of a surety that tunnel would go in the end toward the way of escape, this being the most nigh to the city, and he had a mind to use this to his good, and to the ill of the Noldoli. Messengers by great stealth he dispatched to Melko to set a guard about the outer issue of that way when the assault was made, but he himself thought now to take Eärendil and cast him into the fire beneath the walls, and seizing Idril, he would constrain her to guide him to the secrets of the passage, that he might win out of this terror of fire and slaughter, and drag her withal along with him to the lands of Melko. Now, Meglin was afeard that even the secret token which Melko had given him would fail in that direful sack, and was minded to help that Ainu to the fulfillment of his promises of safety. No doubt had he, however, of the death of Tuor in that great burning, for to Salgon he had confided the task of delaying him in the king's halls, and egging him straight thence into the deadliest of the fight. But lo! Salgon fell into a terror unto death, and he rode home, and lay there now, a quake on his bed. But Tuor fared home with the folk of the wing. Now Tuor did this, though his valour leapt to the noise of war, that he might take farewell of Idril and Erendel, and speed them with a bodyguard down the secret way, ere he returned himself to the battle throng to die if must be. But he found a press of the Mulfolk about his door, and these were the grimmest and least good-hearted of folk that Meglin might get in that city. Yet were they free Noldoli, and under no spell of Melko's like their master. Wherefore, though for the lordship of Meglin they aided, not Idril, no more would they touch of his purpose despite all his curses. Now then, Meglin had Idril by the hair, and sought to drag her to the battlements out of cruelty of heart, that she might see the fall of Erendel to the flames. But he was cumbered by that child, and she fought, alone as she was, like a tigress, for all her beauty and slenderness. There he now struggles and delays, amid oaths, while that folk of the wing draws nigh, and lo! Tuor gives a shout so great that the Orcs hear it afar and waver at the sound of it. Like a crash of tempest the guard of the wing were amid the men of the mole, and these were stricken asunder. When Meglin saw this, he would stab Erendel with a short knife he had, but that child bit his left hand, that his teeth sank in, and he staggered, and stabbed but weakly, and the male of the small coat turned the blade aside, and thereupon Tuor was upon him, and his wrath was terrible to see. He seized Meglin by that hand that held the knife, and broke the arm with the wrench, and then, taking him by the middle, leapt with him upon the walls, and flung him far out. Great was the fall of his body, and it smote Amon Gwareth 3 times ere it pitched in the midmost of the flames, and the name of Meglin has gone out in shame from among Eldar and the Noldoli. Then the warriors of the mole, being more numerous than those few of the wing, and loyal to their lord, came at Tuor, and there were great blows, but no man might stand before the wrath of Tuor, and they were smitten, and driven to fly into what dark holes they might, or flung from the walls. Then Tuor and his men must get them to the battle of the gate, for the noise of it has grown very great, and Tuor has it still in his heart that the city may stand. Yet with Idril he left there Voronway, against his will, and some other swordsmen to be guard for her till he returned, or might send tidings from the fray. Now was the battle at the gate very evil indeed, and Dwelin of the Swallow, as he shot from the walls, was smitten by a fiery bolt from the Balrogs, who leapt about the base of Amon Gwareth, and he fell from the battlements and perished. Then the Balrogs continued to shoot darts of fire, and flaming arrows like small snakes into the sky, and these fell upon the roofs and gardens of Gondolin, till all the trees were scorched, and the flowers and grass burned up, and the whiteness of those walls and colonnades was blackened and seared. Yet a worse matter was it that a company of those demons climbed upon the coils of the serpents of iron, and thence loosed unceasingly from their bows and slings, till a fire began to burn in the city to the back of the main army of the defenders. Then said Rourke in a great voice, "Who now shall fear the Balrogs for all their terror? See before us the accursed ones, who for ages have tormented the children of the Noldoli, and who now set a fire at our backs with their shooting. Come ye of the hammer of wrath, and we will smite them for their evil." Thereupon he lifted his mace, and its handle was long, and he made a way before him by the wrath of his onset, even unto the fallen gate. But all the people of the stricken anvil ran behind like a wedge, and sparks came from their eyes for the fury of their rage. A great deed was that sally, as the Noldoli sing yet, and many of the Orcs were borne back into the fires below. But the men of Rog leapt even among the coils of the serpents, and came at those Balrogs and smote them grievously, for they all had whips of flame and claws of steel, and were in stature very great. They battered them into naught, or catching at their whips, wielded these against them, that they tore them, even as they had aforetime torn the gnomes, and the number of Balrogs that perished was a marvel, and dread to the hosts of Melko. For ere that day never had any of the Balrogs been slain by the hands of elves or men. Then Gothmog, lord of Balrogs, gathered all his demons that were about the city, and ordered them thus. A number made for the folk of the hammer, and gave before them. But the greater company rushing upon the flank contrived to get to their backs, higher upon the coils of the drakes, and nearer to the gates, so that Rog might not win back, save with great slaughter among his folk. But Rog, seeing this, essayed not to win back, as was hoped, but with all his folk fell on those whose part was to give before him, and they fled before him now of dire need rather than of craft. Down into the plain they were harried, and their shrieks rend the airs of Tumladen. Then that house of the hammer fared about smiting and hewing the astonished bands of Melko, till they were hemmed at the last by an overwhelming force of the Orcs and the Balrogs, and a fire drake was loosed upon them. There did they perish about Rog, hewing to the last, till iron and flame overcame them. And it is yet sung that each man of the Hammer of Wrath took the lives of 7 foemen to pay for his own. Then did dread fall more heavily still upon the Gondolin at the death of Rog and the loss of his battalion. And they gave further back into the city, and Penlod perished there in a lane with his back to the wall, and about him many of the men of the pillar, and many of the tower of snow. Now, therefore, Melko's goblins held all the gate, and a great part of the walls on either side, whence numbers of the swallow and those of the rainbow were thrust to doom. But within the city they had won a great space, reaching nigh to the centre, even to the place of the well that adjoined the square of the palace. Yet about those ways and around the gate their dead were piled in uncounted heaps, and they halted therefore and took counsel. Seeing that for the valour of the Gondolin they had lost many more than they had hoped, and far more than those defenders, fearful too were they for that slaughter Rog had done amid the Balrogs. Because of those demons they had great courage and confidence of heart. Now, then the plan that they made was to hold what they had won, while those serpents of bronze and with great feet for trampling climbed slowly over those of iron, and reaching the walls there opened a breach, wherethrough the Balrogs might ride upon the dragons of flame. Yet they knew this must be done with speed, for the heats of those drakes lasted not forever, and might only be plenished from the wells of fire that Melko had made in the fastness of his own land. But even as their messengers were sped, they heard a sweet music that was played amid the host of the Gondolin, and they feared what it might mean. And lo, there came Ecthelion, and the people of the fountain whom Tuor till now had held in reserve, for he watched the most of that affray from the heights of his tower. Now marched those folk to a great playing of their flutes, and the crystal and silver of their array was most lovely to see amid the red light of the fires and the blackness of the ruins. Then, on a sudden, their music ceased, and Ecthelion of the fair voice shouted for the drawing of swords, and before the Orcs might foresee the flashing of the pale blades was amongst them. It is said that Ecthelion's folk there slew more of the goblins than fell ever in all the battles of the Eldele with that race, and that his name is a terror among them to this latest day, and a war cry to the Eldar. Now it is that Tuor and the men of the wing fare into the fight, and ranged themselves beside Ecthelion and those of the fountain, and the twain strike mighty blows and ward each other, and the twain strike mighty blows and ward each many a thrust from the other, and harry the Orcs, so that they win back almost to the gate. But there behold a quaking and a trampling, for the dragons labour mightily at beating a path up Amon Gwareth, and at casting down the walls of the city, and already there is a gap therein, and a confusion of masonry, where the ward towers have fallen in ruin. A confusion of masonry. Now that's quite something, actually. Bands of the Swallow and of the Arch of Heaven there fight bitterly amid the wreck, or contest the walls to east and west with the foe. But even as Tuor comes nigh, driving the Orcs, one of those brazen snakes heaves against the western wall, and a great mass of it shakes and falls, and behind comes a creature of fire, and Balrogs upon it. Flames gust from the jaws of that worm, and folk wither before it, and the wings of the helm of Tuor are blackened, but he stands and gathers about him his guard and all of the Arch and Swallow he can find. Whereas on his right, Ecthelion rallies the men of the Fountain of the South. Now, the Orcs again take heart from the coming of the Drakes, and they mingle with the Balrogs that pour about the breach, and they assail the Gondolin grievously. There, Tuor slew Orthrod, a lord of the Orcs, cleaving his helm, and Balchmeg he hewed asunder, and Lug he smote with his axe, that his limbs were cut from beneath him at the knee. But Ecthelion shore through 2 captains of the goblins at a sweep, and cleft the head of Orcobal, their chiefest champion, to his teeth. And by reason of their great doughtiness of those 2 lords, they came even unto the Balrogs. Of those demons of power, Ecthelion slew 3, for the brightness of his sword cleft the iron of them, and did hurt to their fire, and they writhed. Yet of the leap of that axe, Dramboleg, that was swung by the hand of Tuor, were they still more afraid, for it sang like the rush of eagle's wings in the air, and took death as it fell, and 5 of them went down before it. And so it is that few cannot fight always against the many. And Ecthelion's left arm got a sore rent from a whip of the Balrogs, and his shield fell to earth, even as that dragon of fire drew nigh, amid the ruin of the walls. Then Ecthelion must lean on Tuor, and Tuor might not leave him, though the very feet of the trampling beast were upon them, and they were like to be overborne. But Tuor hewed at a foot of the creature, so that flame spouted forth, and that serpent screamed, lashing with its tail, and many of both Orcs and Noldoli got their death therefrom. Now Tuor gathered his might, and lifted Ecthelion, and amid a remnant of the folk got thereunder, and escaped the drake. Yet dire was the killing of men that beast had wrought, and the Gondolin were sorely shaken. Thus it was that Tuor, son of Peleg, gave before that foe, fighting as he yielded ground, and bore from that battle Ecthelion of the Fountain. But the drakes and the foemen held half the city, and all the north of it. Thence marauding bands fared about the streets, and did much ransacking, or slew in the dark men and women and children, and many, if occasion let, they bound and led back, and flung in the iron chambers amid the dragons of iron, that they might drag them afterward to the thralls of Melko. Now Tuor reached the square of the Folkwell by a way entering from the north, and found there Galdor, denying the western entry by the Arch of Inwe, to a horde of the goblins, but about him was now but a few of those men of the tree. There did Galdor become the salvation of Tuor, for he fell behind his men, stumbling beneath Ecthelion, over a body that lay in the dark, and the Orcs had taken them both, but for the sudden rush of that champion and the dint of his club. There were the scatterlings of the guard of the wing, and of the houses of the tree, and the fountain of the swallow, and the arch, welded to a good battalion. And by the counsel of Tuor they gave way out of that place of the well, seeing that the square of the king that lay next was the more defensible. Now that place at aforetime contained many beautiful trees, both oak and poplar, around a great well of vast depth, and great purity of water. Yet at that hour it was full of the riot and ugliness of those hideous peoples of Melko, and those waters were polluted with their carcasses. Thus comes the last stout gathering of those defenders in the square of the palace of Tuorgon. Among them are many wounded and fainting, and Tuor is weary for the labours of the night and the weight of Ecthelion, who is in a deadly swoon. Even as he led that battalion in by the road of archers from the northwest, and they had much ado to prevent any foe getting behind their backs, a noise arose at the eastward of the square, and lo, Glorfindel is driven in with the last of the men of the Golden Flower. Now, these had sustained a terrible conflict in the great market to the east of the city, where a force of orcs led by Balrogs came on them at unawares as they marched by a circuitous way to the fight about the gate. This they did to surprise the foe upon his left flank, but were themselves ambuscaded. There fought they bitterly for hours, till a fire-drake new come from the breach overwhelmed them, and Glorfindel cut his way out very hardily, and with few men. But that place with its stores and its goodly things of fine workmanship was a waste of flames. The story tells that Tuorgon had sent the men of the Harp to their aid because of the urgency of messengers from Glorfindel, but Saurgon concealed this bidding from them, saying they were to garrison the square of the lesser market to the south, where he dwelt, and they fretted thereat. Now, however, they brake from Saurgon, and were come before the king's hall, and that was very timely, for a triumphant press of foemen was at Glorfindel's heels. On these the men of the Harp, unbidden, fell with great eagerness, and utterly redeemed the cravenhood of their lord, driving the enemy back into the markets, and being leaderless, fared even over wrathfully, so that many of them were trapped in the flames, or sank beneath the breath of the serpent that revelled there. Tuor now drank of the great fountain and was refreshed, and loosening Ecthelion's helm, gave him to drink, splashing his face that his swoon left him. Now those lords, Tuor and Glorfindel, clear the square, and withdraw all the men they may from the entrances, and bar them with barriers, save as yet on the south. Even from that region comes now Egelmoth. He had had a charge of the engines on the wall, but long since deeming matters to call rather for handstrokes about the streets than shooting upon the battlements, he gathered some of the arch and of the swallow about him, and cast away his bow. Then did they fare about the city, dealing good blows whenever they fell in with the bands of the enemy. Thereby he rescued many bands of captives, and gathered no few wandering and driven men, and so got to the king's square with hard fighting, and men were fain to greet him, for they had feared him dead. Now are all the women and children that had gathered there been brought in by Egelmoth stowed in the king's halls, and the ranks of the houses made ready for the last. In that host of survivors are some, be it however few, of all the kindred save of the Hammer of Wrath alone, and the king's house is as yet untouched. Nor is this any shame, for their part was ever to bide fresh to the last, and defend the king. But now the men of Melko have assembled their forces, and 7 dragons of fire have come with the orcs about them, and Balrogs upon them down all the ways from north, east, and west, seeking the square of the king. Then there was carnage at the barriers, and Egelmoth and Tuor went from place to place of the defence, but Ecthelion lay by the fountain, and that stand was the most stubborn valiant that is remembered in all the songs or in any tale. Yet at long last a drake burst the barrier to the north, and there had once been the issue of the Alley of Roses, and a fair place to see or to walk in, but now there is but a lane of blackness, and it is filled with noise.